The heavy oak doors of the grand library at Harcourt House swung shut with a final echoing thud. Reginald Harcourt stood at the head of the long mahogany table, shoulders squared, chin lifted, the very picture of a man who had never known defeat. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching the gold signet ring on his finger and the cold arrogance in his steel-gray eyes. Today was the day he would finally claim what had always been his. By right, the title, the estates, the fortune that made the Harcourt name feared and envied across England. He allowed himself the faintest smile. Beside him, the family solicitor, Mr. Thaddeus, adjusted his spectacles with trembling fingers and cleared his throat. The room was packed with distant relatives and solicitors, all holding their breath. Gentlemen and ladies, Mr. Thaddeus began, his voice thin. We come now to the final codicil of His Grace, the late Duke's last will and testament. He broke the red wax seal. The crack of the seal sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Reginald leaned forward slightly, heart steady, confident. Then the solicitor read the words that would shatter everything. To my stepdaughter, Eleanor Harcourt. The air itself seemed to freeze. I leave the entirety of my unentailed estates, all investments, properties, and the guardianship of the Harcourt legacy. A stunned silence fell so complete that the ticking of the grandfather clock became deafening. Reginald's smile died on his lips. His hands resting on the polished table slowly curled into fists. The signet ring dug painfully into his flesh. What? Did you just say? His voice came out low, dangerous, barely above a whisper. Mr. Thaddeus swallowed hard, refusing to meet the Duke's eyes. I repeat, Your Grace, the bulk of the fortune and the stewardship of the entire Harcourt legacy is bequeathed to Miss Eleanor Harcourt. A wave of shocked whispers erupted around the table like wildfire. Reginald felt the floor tilt beneath him. Eleanor, the woman he had mocked for years, the quiet, unwanted stepdaughter who moved through his father's house like a shadow, the one he had openly called a burden without blood in front of guests more than once. And now, she owned nearly everything. His gaze snapped across the table. There she sat, Eleanor Harcourt, pale as porcelain, her hands folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white. Her hazel eyes were wide with disbelief, lips slightly parted as though she too could not believe what she had just heard. For one fleeting second their eyes met. In that single look, Reginald saw it all, her shock, her fear, and something else. A flicker of quiet strength he had never noticed before. His chest tightened with a rage so sharp it burned. How dare she? How dare his own father do this to him? The whispers grew louder. Someone gasped. A chair scraped back. Reginald's mind reeled. Every grand plan he had made, the new stables, the London townhouse renovation, the political alliances he intended to forge with the family fortune, all of it crumbled in an instant, reduced to ash by a single paragraph written by a dead man. He wanted to laugh. He wanted to roar. Instead, he remained perfectly still, the only sign of the storm inside him being the faint tremor in his clenched jaw. Eleanor lowered her gaze to the table, her breathing shallow. She looked small, fragile. But in that moment, Reginald understood with brutal clarity that the woman he had dismissed for 6 long years had just become the most powerful person in the room. And he had become nothing. The solicitor continued reading, but Reginald no longer heard the words. All he could hear was the sound of his entire world burning down around him. The silence in the library stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then the storm broke. Reginald Harcourt rose slowly from his chair, the legs scraping loudly against the wooden floor. His face was pale, but his eyes burned with barely contained fury. 30 days, Mr. Thaddeus had said quietly after the reading ended. You have 30 days to vacate Harcourt House, Your Grace. The will is clear and unbreakable. 30 days. Reginald stood on the front steps of the only home he had ever known, watching the last of his trunks being loaded onto a plain carriage. The grand fountain still sparkled behind him. The marble lions guarding the entrance still looked down with their cold, familiar pride. But none of it belonged to him anymore. He climbed into the carriage without a backward glance, jaw clenched so tightly it ached. As the wheels began to roll down the long gravel drive, he kept his eyes fixed straight ahead, refusing to watch Harcourt House disappear in the distance. Inside his chest, something raw and ugly twisted tighter with every mile. By the time they reached the small stone manor in the windswept hills of Yorkshire, the rain had started falling in cold, relentless sheets. The house was modest, damp, forgotten. Reginald stepped inside and was hit by the heavy scent of mold and old wood. Only 3 servants remained, loyal old souls who had chosen to follow him into exile. Their faces were kind, but their eyes carried pity he could not bear to see. He walked through the dim rooms, boots echoing on bare floors. A single fire struggled in the hearth of the small parlor. Rain lashed against the windows like angry fingers. This was his kingdom now. A bitter laugh escaped his throat, short and hollow. Meanwhile, back at Harcourt House, Eleanor Harcourt stood alone in the enormous master study, staring at the towering stacks of ledgers and documents that now belonged to her. Her hands trembled as she touched the edge of the massive oak desk. I don't know how to do this," she whispered to the empty room. She had never been trained for any of it. Not the accounts, not the tenants, not the weight of a legacy that suddenly rested on her shoulders. All her life she had been the quiet shadow in the corner, tolerated, but never truly seen. Now the entire world was watching. A soft knock sounded at the door. Beatrice Langley entered, the longtime housekeeper. Her gray hair neatly pinned her posture, calm and steady despite everything. "My Lady Beatrice," said gently, "you don't have to carry this alone." "Not today." Eleanor turned on, eyes bright with unshed tears. "How can I possibly manage all of this?" "Mrs. Langley, I was never meant for any of it." Beatrice crossed the room and placed a warm hand on Eleanor's arm. "Your father saw something in you that others missed. Perhaps it is time you saw it too." Later that same week, Eleanor found herself in the vast, chaotic library, thousands of books scattered in dusty piles after years of neglect. She stood helplessly among them, overwhelmed. That was when Julian Rowe appeared. He was a quiet young man from the nearby village, broad-shouldered with ink-stained fingers and calm, thoughtful eyes. He had come at Beatrice's quiet request to help organize the collection. "You look like you're drowning in paper." "Miss," he said simply, a small, kind smile touching his lips. Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. "I don't even know where to begin." "Then we begin with one shelf," Julian replied. "One book at a time." As the days passed, Eleanor threw herself into the work with quiet determination. She met with tenants, listened to their struggles, and made small changes that felt both terrifying and right. She walked the gardens at dawn, learning the land that now answered to her name. And from his lonely exile in Yorkshire, Reginald watched. He had ridden to the crest of a distant hill one gray afternoon, unable to stay away. Through a spyglass, he could just make out the figures moving across the grounds of Harcourt House. New fences being repaired, smoke rising from chimneys that had once stood cold, servants moving with purpose. He lowered the glass, his hand shaking with rage, and something far more dangerous. Jealousy. Hot, bitter jealousy that clawed at his throat. How dare she step into his world and make it look better? He turned his horse sharply and rode back toward the damp little manor, the wind whipping at his coat. That night, he sat alone by the weak fire, a glass of cheap brandy in his hand, staring into the flames. Memories came unwanted. The way he had spoken to Eleanor over the years, cold, dismissive, cruel, in that careless way powerful men can be. The times he had laughed when others mocked her quiet presence. The way he had never once asked about her dreams, her fears, her pain. Now those memories burned like acid. For the first time in his privileged life, Reginald Harcourt felt truly alone, truly small. And deep beneath the fury and the wounded pride, a tiny, terrifying crack began to form in the armor he had worn for so long. He did not yet have a name for it, but it was the first whisper of something that felt dangerously like regret. Winter had begun to loosen its grip on the Yorkshire hills, but the cold still lingered in Reginald's bones. He stood in the muddy yard behind the small manor sleeves, rolled up sweat mixing with dirt on his forehead. For the first time in his life, the Duke of Harcourt was chopping firewood. His hands, once soft and manicured, were blistered and raw. Every swing of the axe sent a jolt of pain up his arms, but he welcomed it. The physical ache was easier to bear than the silence inside his chest. He paused, breathing hard, and wiped his face with the back of his forearm. From this lonely place, news still reached him, and every piece of it cut deeper than the last. Meanwhile, at Harcourt House, Eleanor walked the frost-covered fields with quiet purpose. Her cloak fluttered behind her as she spoke with tenant farmers, listening more than she spoke. She had ordered repairs to leaking roofs and broken fences. She had reduced rents for families struggling after a poor harvest. And yesterday, she had opened the doors of an old stone cottage and turned it into a small school for the children of the estate. A school. Word spread quickly through the county. In drawing rooms across London and beyond, teacups paused mid-air. Whispers turned sharp. How improper! A woman, managing estates, teaching peasant children to read, she forgets her place. Eleanor heard the gossip. Of course she did. She stood at the window of the study one evening, fingers pressed against the cool glass, watching the golden light spill from the new schoolhouse across the fields. Her heart beat fast with both fear and fierce determination. "I know they think I'm foolish," she said softly to the empty room. "But these children, they deserve more than endless labor and darkness." She closed her eyes, remembering years of being invisible in this very house. The quiet meals where no one asked her opinion. The way Reginald had once looked through her as if she barely existed. Now she refused to disappear. Back in Yorkshire, Reginald received an unexpected visitor. Theodore Langford rode up the muddy lane one gray afternoon, dismounting with his usual easy grace. Behind him came Arabella Finch, Eleanor's distant cousin, her riding habit dusty from the long journey, her eyes bright with quiet fire. They found Reginald in the stables, brushing down his horse with slow, deliberate strokes. "You look different," Theodore said carefully, studying his old friend's calloused hands and hardened jaw. Reginald gave a short, bitter laugh. "Different, I am chopping my own wood and eating bread that doesn't taste of silver trays. Tell me, Theo, how does one become smaller and still breathe?" Arabella stepped closer, her voice gentle but unflinching. "Eleanor is doing remarkable things at Harcourt House. The tenants speak of her with something close to hope. She listens. She acts. While you—" She let the words hang. Reginald's hand stilled on the horse's neck. "While you wasted it all." That night the three of them sat by the struggling fire. Theodore spoke plainly, as only a true friend could. "You always believed power was something you were born to hold, Reginald, but your father saw what you refused to see. Eleanor has kindness where you have pride. She has vision where you had only entitlement." Reginald stared into the flame's jaw tight. Every word landed like a stone in still water. He remembered riding past the estate weeks ago, hidden on the ridge. He had watched Eleanor walking among the workers, her head high, her voice calm as she gave instructions. He had seen children laughing as they carried books into the little schoolhouse. And in that moment, something inside him had cracked wide open. Shame. Deep, burning shame. Because she was doing it better. She was healing what he had never even noticed was broken. He rose abruptly and walked to the window, pressing his forehead against the cold glass. His reflection stared back, a man no longer young, no longer invincible. "I mocked her for years," he whispered, voice rough. "I made her feel small, because it made me feel large. And now?" His breath fogged the pain. Now she is becoming everything I failed to be." Theodore and Arabella exchanged a quiet glance, but said nothing more. They left the next morning, leaving Reginald alone with the weight of their words and the growing storm inside his soul. That night, sleep would not come. He lay in the narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, memories flooding him unbidden. The careless cruelties, the cold dismissals, the way he had reduced Eleanor to nothing more than an inconvenience in his perfect world. Now the world had flipped, and he was the inconvenience. Far away in the warmth of Harcourt House, Eleanor sat at the desk that once belonged to Reginald's father. A single candle burned low. She held a letter from one of the tenant mother's simple, grateful words that brought unexpected tears to her eyes. For the first time, she felt the terrifying thrill of possibility. But she also felt the heavy shadow of what she had taken from Reginald, even if it had never truly been his to lose. Two hearts, separated by miles of cold English countryside, moved through the same sleepless night. One carried the weight of sudden power. The other carried the slow, painful birth of regret. And somewhere in the silence between them, the first fragile threads of rebellion, quiet, determined, and unstoppable, continued to weave themselves into the fabric of both their lives. Months had slipped by like cold river water. Reginald Harcourt no longer recognized the man who stared back at him from the cracked mirror above the wash basin. His once smooth hands were rough and scarred. His shoulders had broadened from real labor. The proud tilt of his chin had softened into something quieter, heavier. He spent his days working the small plot of land behind the manor, repairing fences, tending to the few animals they could afford. The villagers had begun to speak to him, not as the mighty Duke, but simply as Mr. Harcourt. And in their casual conversations they told stories about her, about how Lady Eleanor had saved the failing wheat crop with new drainage ditches, how she sat with the children in the little schoolhouse teaching them letters by candlelight, how the tenants now spoke her name with quiet respect instead of fear. Every word was a mirror, and every reflection cut deeper than the last. One gray afternoon, Theodore Langford and Arabella Finch returned. They did not come with pity this time. They came with a purpose. The three of them sat in the modest parlor as rain drummed steadily against the windows. A single oil lamp flickered between them. "I've heard about the South Field," Theodore said quietly. "The one that flooded last month. Eleanor is trying to save it. But the cost is more than she expected. The tenants are frightened they'll lose everything." Reginald's hand tightened around his cup until the knuckles turned white. He remembered that field. He had ridden past it once years ago and never given it a second thought. Now it mattered. Arabella leaned forward, her voice soft but urgent. "She's fighting alone, Reginald. Truly alone." That night, after his friends had gone, Reginald sat at the small wooden table and counted every coin he had left. It was pathetically little, the savings of a man who had once never needed to count anything. He stared at the small pile for a long time. Then, without allowing himself to think too much, he wrote a short, unsigned note and sealed it with plain wax. The next morning he rode into the nearest village and handed the entire sum to a trusted messenger, instructing him to deliver it anonymously to the steward at Harcourt House. It was not enough to solve everything, but it was everything he had. As he rode back through the cold mist, something inside his chest shifted, a painful, terrifying crack in the wall he had built around his heart. A few days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the manor. Beatrice Langley stepped down from a modest carriage, her cloak damp from the journey. She looked older than Reginald remembered, but her eyes were as steady as ever. She refused tea. She refused to sit. Instead, she stood in the dim hallway and looked directly at him. "I have come only once, Your Grace," she said quietly, "and I will speak only one thing." Reginald's throat tightened. He waited. "Your father did not leave the legacy to Miss Eleanor because she carried his blood. He left it to her because he believed she would become the person you have never dared to be." The words landed like a stone dropped into still, deep water. Beatrice turned to leave but paused at the door. "She is not your enemy, Reginald. She never was. Then she was gone. Reginald stood motionless long after the sound of the carriage wheels had faded. He walked slowly to the window and pressed his palm flat against the cold glass. Outside, the Yorkshire hills stretched gray and endless under a heavy sky. Tears, hot, unexpected, burned at the corners of his eyes. Not for the lost fortune, not for the grand house or the title's power, but for the man he had been. For all the years he had chosen pride over kindness. For every cruel word he had spoken to Eleanor without ever seeing the quiet strength in her. For the father who had loved him enough to wound him with the truth. The regret was no longer anger. It was a deep, aching sorrow that settled heavy in his chest. For the first time, Reginald Harcourt did not want his old life back. He wanted to become someone worthy of the life he had lost. He wanted to become someone Eleanor might one day look at without fear or resentment. He sank into the old armchair by the dying fire, elbows on his knees, head bowed. The mirror in the ashes had finally shown him the truth, and the truth hurt more than any exile ever could. Yet somewhere beneath the pain, a fragile spark of hope flickered to life. A quiet, desperate longing to make things right, not by reclaiming power, but by learning how to serve it with humility. Far away at Harcourt House, Eleanor stood in the same library where the will had been read, unaware of the silent gift that had just arrived to help save the South Field. She touched the edge of the desk gently, her heart full of both fear and quiet wonder at the weight she now carried. Two souls still separated by miles, and silence had begun, without knowing it, to walk toward the same difficult light. The wind carried the scent of smoke long before the flames were visible. Harcourt House had become a place of quiet hope. Eleanor had turned cold marble halls into warm spaces where tenant children laughed and farmers spoke without fear. The estate breathed differently now, gentler, more alive. But one merciless night fire struck without warning. It began in the old stables and raced through the dry fields, devouring everything in its path. By the time the alarm bells rang, the blaze had already reached the edge of the great library. Valuable books, centuries of knowledge, and the fragile dreams Eleanor had carefully nurtured were all in danger of turning to ash. Eleanor stood in the chaos cloak wrapped tightly around her face, streaked with soot and tears. Her voice cracked as she shouted orders, but inside she felt the terrifying weight of watching something she had built with her own hands begin to crumble. Then, through the smoke and falling rain, a familiar figure appeared. Reginald Harcourt. He was no longer dressed as a duke. His clothes were simple, worn from months of labor. His face was gaunt, his eyes hollow with exhaustion, yet there was a quiet resolve in them she had never seen before. He did not ask for permission. He simply rolled up his sleeves and joined the line of men passing buckets of water. He worked beside the tenants, shoulder to shoulder, throwing himself into the fight to save what Eleanor had created. No commands, no demands, just steady, determined effort until the first light of dawn finally broke through the smoke. When the worst of the fire was finally contained, the south fields lay blackened, and the library stood half destroyed, its once grand shelves now charred and dripping with rain. Eleanor walked slowly through the ruins, her boots crunching over wet ash. The air was thick with the smell of burned paper and wet wood. She stopped when she saw him. Reginald stood alone in what remained of the library, kneeling among the ruins. His hands, those once aristocratic hands, were carefully lifting a singed book from the floor, brushing away soot as gently as if he were holding something sacred. He looked up when he heard her footsteps. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Rain dripped steadily from the damaged roof, echoing in the silence between them. Eleanor's voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper. "Why are you here, Reginald?" He rose slowly, the charred book still cradled in his hands. His eyes met hers without arrogance, without anger, only raw honesty and deep, aching regret. "Because I finally understand what I lost," he said quietly. "Not the houses, not the money, but the chance to be the kind of man my father hoped I would become, and the chance to see you for who you truly are." His voice faltered for the first time. I was cruel to you, Eleanor. For years. I made you feel small because it made me feel powerful. I see that now. And I am not here to ask for my old life back. I have no right. He took one careful step closer, rain dripping from his hair. I only ask to stay. Not as master. Not even as equal yet. But as someone who wants to learn. To listen. To serve. To love. Without demanding anything in return. Eleanor stood very still, her heart pounding so loudly she was certain he could hear it. Memories flooded her every cold glance, every dismissive word, every lonely night she had spent feeling invisible in this very house. Tears welled in her eyes, but she did not look away. She had spent the long night thinking, walking through the smoking fields, weighing the pain of the past against the man standing before her, now broken, humbled, and, strangely, sincere. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft, but carried the quiet strength she had found in the last year. I will not give the throne back to you, Reginald. She paused, letting the words settle between them. But I am willing to let you stand beside me. Not as the man you once were, but as the man you are trying to become. We can build something new together, a different kind of legacy, one rooted in compassion instead of power. Reginald's breath caught. For a moment he could not speak. Then he gave the smallest nod, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, he whispered. That is more than I deserve. The first rays of morning light began to filter through the broken roof of the library, casting a gentle golden glow over the ashes. Reginald knelt once more, carefully placing the rescued book on a dry shelf. Eleanor stepped closer and knelt beside him. Together in silence they began gathering what could still be saved, one blackened page at a time, side by side. No longer master and shadow, but two people scarred by the past, choosing to walk forward into something new. A quiet throne built not on gold or titles, but on the slow, difficult, beautiful work of becoming better. And in that gentle morning light, with rain still falling softly outside, and the scent of smoke and hope hanging in the air, the Harcourt legacy began its truest chapter. Not one of inheritance, but one of redemption. This story reminds us that real power is never about what we own. It is about who we choose to become when everything is taken away. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for listening and for allowing this story to speak to your heart. The Wild West still holds countless truths, some painful, some tender, all worth remembering. Stay with us. Subscribe, comment, and invite others to discover these untamed stories, from our hearts to yours. Thank you for being part of this journey. Aviso legal, barra disclaimer. Each story shared here is produced for storytelling enjoyment. Certain scenes may include fictional or dramatized elements inspired by historical circumstances. Although AI tools assist us in visuals narration and script development, the emotional tone editing and quality control are conducted by people to ensure meaningful experiences. We fully uphold YouTube's policies, using no deceptive recreations or impersonations of real individuals. All creative resources are properly licensed. Unauthorized copying, re-uploading, or remixing is not permitted. Thank you for supporting the effort behind every episode we create.